stories. Russia's defense ministry says that further territory has been captured in Ukraine's Donetsk region. This comes as the Kremlin confirmed that President Putin and US President Trump will discuss settling the Ukraine conflict in Alaska, with the two leaders set to hold a joint conference after talks. This comes as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has met with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer at Downing Street ahead of vital talks between Trump and Putin. It comes as the Ukrainian leader says Europe has pledged $1.5 billion worth of US aid. Meanwhile, strikes have been reported from both Kyiv and Moscow. Injuries have been reported after Ukrainian drone attacks in Belgorod and Volgograd. It comes as Russia's defense ministry says that several Ukrainian missile factories have been hit by Moscow's military. Israel's far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich has approved plans for a settlement that will split East Jerusalem from the occupied West Bank. His office says the move would bury the idea of a Palestinian state. A UN commission has found that violence against Syrian Alawites likely included war crimes. This in a report released today. Sectarian violence in the Alawite heartlands saw murder, torture and inhumane acts to dead bodies, according to the report. Wildfires in several European nations are continuing to rage on, with 3 lives claimed so far in the blazes. Mass evacuations have been ordered, with 440,000 hectares scorched so far this year, double the average to this time. 4 people have been killed and 5 have been injured in an explosion on the outskirts of Idlib, Syria, that according to the Syrian state news agency. Syria's official news reports authorities are still working to verify the nature of the blast. And Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has urged Thailand and Cambodia to resolve their border dispute through dialogue during 3-way talks in Yunnan. China offered to help with reconciliation, including demining and a possible border reopening as part of efforts to rebuild trust between the 2 Southeast Asian nations. But let's start with the ongoing diplomacy surrounding the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russian President Vladimir Putin has held a high-level meeting with members of Russia's top leadership, government officials and the presidential administration to finalize preparations for Friday's Alaska summit with US President Donald Trump. This, according to a TASS report. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov said planning has entered its final phase, with teams working intensively to resolve technical matters, including visas, after the meeting was announced just 5 days ago. He stressed that the political agenda remains the central focus. During the session, Putin said the United States is making a sincere effort to find a solution to the Ukraine crisis and that peace would be strengthened if Moscow and Washington can reach agreements on strategic offensive arms control. The European Commission welcomed President Trump's remark that the US would participate in Ukraine security guarantees, though it said the details of that role are for the US administration to clarify. Well, joining us to discuss this latest update that we bring you, of course, ahead of this meeting set for Alaska between President Trump and President Putin tomorrow in Alaska. Matti Zweig, a geopolitical expert, joining us live from Israel. Matti, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us. Comments here from Putin. It all sounds very positive, more concern from the European perspective, at least the Western allied European perspective. Do you think this is just rhetoric from Putin and his top team?
Well, thank you for having me again. I think this time it cannot be only rhetoric. And I tell you why, because Vladimir Putin has been hearing already 6 months or more Donald Trump, and he say, okay, I would like to listen, and I would like in some moment to go to a ceasefire, and but he continued and continued because he wanted this to be under his terms. After everything that happened in the last 6 months, and all the rhetoric that has been thrown on this theme, and you know what happened in these 6 months, the Russians have recovered many territories that they wanted to have as leverage to start even thinking about a ceasefire. and they have conquered several territories that they are key for further movements if they are going to fail in this ceasefire. And now maybe this is going to be also a tool to start thinking what is better for himself. I'm talking about Vladimir Putin. And let's look also what was going on from the Trump side. He failed in going further in a peace agreement or finishing what is going on between Israel and Gaza, and also failed in this. But in the meanwhile, he was doing other movements like India, Pakistan, Cambodia, Thailand, and lately also, very famous, the agreement between, the historical agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And maybe Putin is feeling that the things are moving under his feet. So maybe in all this context, he's going to give more weight to a meeting with Donald Trump, and maybe giving some concessions, some swapping between prisoners and bodies, and also maybe a kind of ceasefire that let's see what is the quantity of time that is going to hold, because everything can fail, of course, but things are going to be different now. That's what I think.
Yes, absolutely, Matti. As we come in, we are playing some of the latest visuals that we have received from this meeting that has taken place with Putin and his top officials. Of course, it's not just the Russia-Ukraine conflict that is set to be discussed, Matti, at this meeting between President Trump and President Putin. Do you think Putin could be using the war potentially as a make-weight in terms of trying to secure financial deals that boost Russia with the US, but also potentially arms? We heard Putin address that directly. Is he referring to nuclear weapons?
Well, as we have discussed in the past, nuclear weapons and movements and talkings about nuclear weapons have been happening all the time. If we are talking about the movement of nuclear capabilities from Russia to Belarus, it means to pass nuclear bombs from one country to the other, and until the avoiding all kinds of agreements that have been in the past, like new equipments in nuclear capabilities and talks that had been between the big powers in the past, and they stopped in the last years. All of this is on the table. I don't think that also they stopped, because under the table they have continued to talk in a way that they say, look, if we are going to really meet and the public is going to see this, so we have to bring something positive on the table to talk about all themes. And of course, Putin is going to use this opportunity also to ask from Donald Trump to lift the sanctions against him. Not that they are so effective, but some of them, they are mining their economic capabilities. And now with the price of the oil and everything, it's all a package together that is going to try to use for the benefit of himself and Russia.
Absolutely, Matti. Thank you ever so much for discussing this topic. Of course, this is ever evolving, and there are so many developments that we continue to bring you. So make sure you're tuning into NewsX World for all of the updates ahead of that meeting tomorrow in Alaska. Matti will be joining us later in the programme, but we first shift our attention to the Middle East, and the European Union has firmly rejected any territorial change in Gaza that is not part of a political agreement. The spokesperson stressed that any such move would undermine the prospects for peace and reiterated the EU's support for a negotiated two-state solution. The comments come as Israel prepares a new offensive in Gaza City, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu suggesting that Palestinians could be allowed to leave the enclave. The EU joins a growing list of nations voicing concern over the humanitarian toll and displacement caused by the near 2-year war. Well, a few updates for us to go through there, and joining us to do so, Jonathan Hoffman, the former Vice President of the Zionist Federation of the United Kingdom, who joins us live from London. Thank you ever so much, Jonathan, for joining us. Let's first just get your initial reaction to these comments from the European Union.
Well, Joshua, you have to be a little bit careful, because This was a spokesman in answer to a question. It wasn't a European Union statement agreed by all of the members, because that would be quite difficult, because there are countries who disagree with each other. For example, Hungary is much more aligned with what Israel wants to do than, say, Germany, France, or Italy. So this was a comment from a Commission spokesperson, which, to my mind, doesn't have the same weight as a statement from the European Union signed by leaders of all countries.
Yes, absolutely. But let's shift our attention to some of the European nations then, if not directly the whole European Union bloc as a collective. Of course, comments coming from many of the pivotal nations within that group, talking about the situation in Gaza. Let's look at rhetoric as a whole, Jonathan. Of course, it has shifted in recent times, and this comes amidst Benjamin Netanyahu firmly stating that his operations will move forward. Is Israel isolating themselves on the geopolitical situation?
Well, looking at the European Union countries, you've got Spain and France who say that at the time of the UN meeting, General Assembly in September, they will say that they recognize a Palestinian state. The United Kingdom's done the same, but of course the United Kingdom is no longer in the European Union. The European Union's official stance is that Israel needs to come to a peace agreement. There needs to be a peace agreement. There needs to be movement to a two-state solution. But not all countries in the European Union are agreed on the path or on the timing of that. And as far as I think Germany has said that they will impose a boycott on weapons deliveries to Israel, but they haven't said they will recognize a Palestinian state. So things are not uniform within the European Union. As far as Israel becoming isolated in the world is concerned, the most important player, the United States, is obviously still on side.
Yes.
And other countries, for example, Argentina and Hungary, are on side. So it's not true to say that Israel is an international pariah. The anti-Israel forces like to make that comment, but it simply isn't true. There's plenty of support for Israel among, for example, Christians in the United States, President Trump, and other countries as well.
Yes.
So it's much more of a nuanced, complex position than you might think, Joshua.
Absolutely, Jonathan. Of course, it is extremely nuanced, as you've said, but also extremely divisive. And of course, a topic of conversation that continues to be had surrounding the situation of hostages being held, the conditions that they're being held in. I just want to bring it back to hostages. Of course, protests within Israel, some anti-government protesters talking about ending this conflict, but also, of course, an acknowledgement that the situation for hostages is getting worse potentially day by day. Those videos, those horrific videos released in recent times of hostages starved, digging their own graves, shocking the world. Do you, Jonathan, think that Benjamin Netanyahu's offensive expanding into Gaza City is putting those hostages and their well-being first?
The Israeli government has a terribly difficult balancing act to carry out. On the one hand, they want to move further to eliminating Hamas. On the other hand, they want to rescue the hostages. And clearly those two aims sometimes conflict with each other. We saw more than a year ago that there were, I think, 4 hostages who were killed by friendly fire from Israel. And that is always a risk. But one has to ask, Joshua, is it better for those hostages to starve slowly and die that way, or is it better that they should come to a death with Israel trying to eliminate Hamas? You know, these are terribly difficult moral decisions. Nobody would envy Netanyahu or the government in trying to make those decisions, but that is what people vote for. People vote for politicians to make very difficult decisions. I wouldn't like to be making that decision. I'm sure you wouldn't either. But, you know, that decision has to be made. It's an incredibly difficult decision, and nobody can envy the people who have to make it.
Absolutely. Jonathan Hoffman, thank you ever so much for that insight and context on a conversation that is so polarising and is so difficult. Of course, pain on both sides, a potential humanitarian crisis in Gaza and hostages being held now for almost 2 years. We will continue to bring you all of those updates here on NewsX World from the ground in Gaza and diplomatically. But let's move now over to North America, where Federal Appeals Court has lifted an injunction that required the State Department to continue foreign aid payments, granting a victory to US President Donald Trump. The three-judge panel ruled 2-1 that a lower court erred in ordering the administration to restore aid funds previously approved by Congress. Trump had paused all foreign aid for 90 days on this day of his inauguration, taking steps to restructure US aid and place staff on leave. Non-profit groups receiving federal funding sued, claiming the freeze was unlawful. The majority said the groups lack legal standing to challenge the president, and only the Government Accountability Office should bring such a case. Circuit Judge Florence Pan dissented and warned that the ruling undermines the constitutional system of checks and balances. The White House called the decision a win against radical left groups interfering with the president's foreign aid policies. Well, Matti Zweig, a geopolitical expert, once again joining us live from Israel. Matti, thank you for holding on and staying with us here. Checks and balances, a big word that is obviously used a hell of a lot in talk around policy, politics, foreign aid, foreign policy. In your opinion, is this limiting checks and balances, or is this just an acknowledgement of the Trump administration being able to do what they have been given a mandate to do?
Well, checks and balances are part of the courts that they have to say about this. And they have a court, and the court ruled that he can continue with his plan of cutting the foreign aid, and they are not cutting these checks and balances. So, you know, when it's good for you, you say it's interfering in the checks and balances, and when it's not good for you, you cannot say the opposite. Let's see what is really on this situation here. Anyway, by the law, about 83% of all the aid to US aid and the aid for HIV, etc., it has been cut by Marco Rubio. You know, of course, it was the agreement of the Trump administration. And it's an ideological thing from one side, and from the other side, a question of scheme, how it's built, how is because an agency can have very good will and very good intentions. The question if it's really doing what he's meant to do, or is a corrupted scheme. Trump administration said they are a corrupted scheme and they must be closed or to adequate to the new times, etc. And that's what they are doing. You can like it or not, but they are trying to do what they said from the beginning, and they are doing this only now because the court was waiting to give also a verdict about this. Two of the judges were, let's say one was like pro-Trump, but it was independent, another one independent, another one was appointed from Joe Biden. So you cannot say that it's not legal. It's legal, and it's possible for them to do all these reforms that they, of course, the voters in 3 years, 3.5 years, that are going to say if they were right or not. You know, this reminds me, in the last year and a half, 2 years, the government of Argentina, because the government of Argentina was doing several things that they were look alike. They were closing very important agency to research cancer, to help women, etc. And after the close of this, the help for these themes with other names, it was much more effective. This is a fact. So if this is going to be the consequence of this closing or diminishing the quantity of batches, I don't know. But usually you have to look the facts and not only the nice words.
Yes.
If they are not corrupted and they are doing what they have to do, everything is going to be better now.
Matti, before we do move on, let's look at the global impacts here. We know that US funding goes to so many places across the world. Donald Trump is clear on making America great again and putting the American people first. But we can't, of course, dismiss the impact that this will have on areas that are facing famine, civil wars, etc., with such sweeping funding freezes. Is there a risk that this backfires on the US, with another nation, potentially a behemoth financially like China, stepping in to support that aid and potentially then wielding more global influence?
Well, there is no vacuum in anything, not in foreign aid, not in local projects, and not in anything that you pick. I mean, if the Chinese are going to enter with all this aid instead of the US, I don't know. I know they entered very, very strong in all East Africa and in other countries, and they are really very important and rising power in all these countries. If these kind of governmental agencies are going to be changed by private NGOs, that they are going to do the same or even better, we have to look, because you have a lot of them, hundreds of them, from the US, from Europe, even from Latin America, and we have to do what they do on the ground. That's
Yes.
what I mean, because if you take a theme very important, that they were helping in programs to avoid HIV in Malawi or in Rwanda or in Uganda, etc., the question is if this money was going to help the people or not.
Yes,
And we
Matti,
know that
unfortunately, I'm so sorry to interject, but we are unfortunately out of time. I wish we had longer to speak on this topic. Thank you for your insight on not just this, but also the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which we spoke about earlier in the programme. Let's move on now, and European nations are marking 80 years since the end of World War II on the continent. Ceremonies in Germany and across Europe honour millions lost in the deadliest war in history. Leaders are calling for peace and unity amid today's global tensions. In Asia, Russia's State Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin has arrived in Pyongyang. He will join North Korean officials for events marking 80 years since the end of Japanese colonial rule. Crowds waved Russian and North Korean flags as he was greeted by senior leader Cho Ryong-hae. In Japan, anger over the US military presence is growing in Okinawa. Residents hold near-daily protests against base construction in Henoko. They cite decades of crimes and incidents involving US soldiers, including reported sexual assaults. Survivors of wartime trauma say the military presence has never left since 1945. Women's groups demand urgent action as the world marks 8 decades since the Pacific War's end. In Okinawa, residents share personal stories of loss and opposition to the US military presence. Let's listen to what they had to say.
沖縄戦っていうやっぱり体験がやっぱりまず大きいと思います。で、僕らもやっぱりこの沖縄戦で4名に1人が亡くなったっていうことがあってね、僕のおじいちゃんとかおじさんもやっぱ亡くなってるわけですよ。で、だからそういうもう沖縄戦っていうのがあって、でこれがしかしながらなんていうかな、こう戦争終わったんだけど、しかしながら米軍そのまま居残ってずーっと今まで来てるわけですよ、80年間。
私がですね、ちょうど復帰前高校3年生の時にですね海兵隊による強盗殺人事件っていう形になって今逮捕されて刑務所入ったんですけどね、その時に強盗の目的は殺すつもりはなかったかもしれないけど、ブロックで頭割って逃げてるんですよ。で奪ったお金が10ドル。性暴力に限らずにいろんな事件が沖縄で起きてるんですよ。この交通事故だったり住居侵入だったり、いろんな事件をこう引っ張っていくと辿っていくと結局みんな米軍人の犯罪っていうのになっていって、じゃあやっぱり基地はいらないんじゃないということになっていくわけですね。だからアメリカ人が嫌いってわけではないですよ。
Well, joining us to discuss a host of topics there, Dr. Satoru Nagao, a fellow at the Hudson Institute, who joins us live from Tokyo, Japan. Dr. Nagao, as always, a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thank you for your time. Let's first look at the fact that this is the 80th anniversary since the end of the Second World War, this coming in a time where geopolitical tensions feel as if they're at an all-time high. Of course, so much concern over growing conflicts and the impact of nuclear weapons, of course, something which was pivotal in ending the Second World War, but also such a dark day for so many and the future of combat. What's your first reaction to these memorial services, of course, in the face of that instability?
So, should I say something?
Yes, please, Dr. Nagao.
Okay. Firstly, I need to say that there is a crime of the U.S. Army, that is true. But at the same time, I need to emphasize the crime rate of the U.S. military force in Japan is not high. It's not high. So that is a very important part. So overemphasis of the crime of the U.S. military forces is because it is useful. Why? Who commit this is simply China. Because this is very useful. World War II, China and the United States are same side against Japan. That's why under the current escalation of the U.S.-China rivalry, China want to send a message to the U.S., you are the friend. And Japan is the real enemy. Secondly, because of Japan, China can legitimize their rapid military modernization. That's why they overemphasize Japan's threat. Look at this, World War II, Japan was empire, Japan was brutal. That's why China needs a strong military. And in this case, they want to divide China, China want to divide the US and Japan. So that's why currently in Okinawa, anti-US movement activists came from other places and funded by China. So that's why this is quite political.
Yes, of course, Dr. Nagao, sorry to interject. Dr. Nagao, thank you ever so much for that insight on that topic. I do want to pivot back, just because of timings, onto these World War II ending memorial days. Thank you again for that insight. It does provide a unique perception on what we were talking about. But let's bring it back to these 80th anniversary celebrations and commemorations at the end of the Second World War. How significant is this in the face of course, continuing tensions?
Yes, 80th anniversary, I have already mentioned about the reason. For China, this is very important. United States is a former friend of China, so that's why China want to send a message, you are friend. And China want to divide the US and Japan, because if the US-Japan alliance is an enemy of China, China faces a bigger threat. But if China is, if US is US, Japan is Japan, in this case, China can expand their territory. So that's why, for China, emphasis of the World War II is very important event to survive in the next decade. So that's why this is important. And they try to support anti-US movement in Okinawa. Why? Why? Because this is useful to divide US and Japan.
Yes.
And in this case, very important fact we need to remember. In China, China recently holds some conferences. Okinawa was part of China. So not only the Senkaku Island, China is preparing to expand their territory claim to Okinawa in the near future. So that's why, indeed, China wants to get Okinawa itself. So that is a big threat for Japan. So
yes, Dr. Nagao, unfortunately we are out of time. I apologise to have to cut you off again, but thank you ever so much, as always, for joining us and providing that insight. Of course, there are memorial services going on across the world, in Europe. Also, that meeting between top diplomats of Russia and North Korea could have other implications, as those bilateral ties continue to strengthen. We will continue to monitor all of those developments from across the world. But we come back to Europe as wildfires are raging across southern parts of the continent, the Balkans and parts of Turkey and Syria, fanned by relentless heat waves and strong winds. In Spain, firefighters are battling multiple blazes in Galicia, Leon and near Madrid. Meanwhile, France is battling blazing forest fires. Let's have a listen to what Gauthier Rudat, Gaudemer Communda, had to say.
Tout à fait. Alors depuis que les pompiers ont adopté une posture très sévère et qu'ils nous ont informés, donc nous on a engagé ce qu'on appelle le peloton vigilance forêt, donc un peloton qui est composé de 15 réservistes de la gendarmerie, qui est commandé par un officier de réserve de la gendarmerie, qui a été mis à disposition de la compagnie de gendarmerie de Longron pour faire de la prévention contre...
Well, devastatingly, 3 people have died this week, including 2 in Lyon and 1 near the capital. The country now in its 10th day of a record-breaking heatwave has requested Canadian planes from European partners. In Greece, flames swept through villages near Patras, forcing evacuations from 25 settlements and leaving charred homes, burnt vehicles and scorched hillsides stretching to the sea. Residents say they had little warning as the fire spread rapidly. Let's listen now to some residents.
Φοβόμαστε γιατί είναι νύχτα και τα αεροπλάνα δεν θα προλάβουν τη σβήσουν τη φωτιά.
Τόσα πολλά που έχουν εξαπλωθεί τόσο πολύ που τα επίγεια μέσα είναι διάσπαρτα, οπότε δεν μπορούν να επικεντρωθούν σε ένα συγκεκριμένο σημείο για να αντιμετωπίσουν.
Meanwhile, Albania is facing a critical week with 24 active fires. Thousands of firefighters, soldiers and emergency crews are battling blazes in the Delvina region and beyond. Satellite imagery from the EU's Copernicus programme and NASA shows the fire fronts across Greece, Turkey, Albania and Portugal with smoke visible from space. The EU Science Hub is reporting that around 440,000 hectares have burned so far in 2025, this doubling the average for this time of year. Authorities warn the combination of arson, lightning strikes, extreme heat and dry winds is making firefighting operations increasingly difficult.